So I have us on page 226. And if you don't have this edition, it's chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, beginning with verse 21. It's the start of the, no, we're in the midst of the fourth aliyah, but what I want to do is read 21 through 28 to just get to the end of the fourth aliyah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Hem kinuni below el, ki asuni b'havlehem, va'ani akni'em below am, v'goy naval ach isem. Ki esh kadcha v'api, v'tikad ad she'ol tachtit, v'tochal eretz v'yevula, v'telahet mostei harim. Aspe alemo ra'ot, chitzai achalebam, Mezei ra'av ulechume reshef beketev meriri v'shen behemot ashalach bam im chamat zochale afar michutz teshakel cherev umechadarim ema gam bachur gam betula yonek im ish seva amarti af ehem ashbita me'enosh zichram Lulei kaas oyev gur pen yinakru saremo, pen yomru yadenu rama velo Adonai paal kol zot. Ki goy ovad etzot hema ve'en bahem tevuna. They incensed me with no gods, vexed me with their futilities. I'll incense them with a no folk, vex them with a nation of fools. For a fire has flared in my wrath and burned to the bottom of Sheol, has consumed the earth and its increase, eaten down to the base of the hills. I will sweep misfortunes on them, use up my arrows on them, wasting famine, ravaging plague, deadly pestilence, and fanged beasts will I let loose against them with venomous creepers in dust. The sword shall deal death without, as shall the terror within, to youth and maiden alike, the suckling as well as the aged. I might have reduced them to naught, made their memory cease among men, but for fear of the taunts of the foe, their enemies who might misjudge and say, our own hand has prevailed, none of this was wrought by the Lord, for they are a folk void of sense, lacking in all discernment. Okay, so let's take a look at Rashi on this, back on 226.
I just want to say
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
the translation is completely different. I mean, it's not just a word here and there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's poetic.
Yeah.
So makes it more difficult to translate. And then the new translation is trying to make sense of the poetry. Just trying to make sense of the poetry as opposed to just focusing on the literal translation.
And yet we're doing this literally.
Well,
word for word.
no, not really. We're looking at the commentary on it. And the commentary is trying to figure it out too. But the literal, I don't know.
Okay, I'm just pointing it out.
I don't think the upshot of the old versus the new is so different. I really don't.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at Rashi. They incensed me, see verse 16, with no gods, with something that is not a god at all. A no folk, a people with no name. Behold, the land of Chaldea. This is the people that has ceased to be. So as an example from Isaiah of a people that no longer exists. And of Esau, it says, I will make you least among nations. You shall be most despised. So just another example. Right. So that apparently, according to the footnote, this could be a reference to the Romans too. Vex them with a nation of fools. These are the heretics. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And burn to the bottom of Sheol, to the very foundation. So Sheol is a word in the Torah, also in other parts of the Bible, for underground. Before the rabbis, this is the only reference in the Bible as to what happens when we die. Our bodies go down to Sheol, according to the Torah, to the Bible. So it's the netherworld. But I can't say more about that because the Torah or the Bible doesn't describe anything about it. Has consumed the earth and its increase, rather the land and its increase, their land. Eaten down to the base of the hills, rather set ablaze the foundations of the mountains. Jerusalem, which is founded upon the mountains, Jerusalem, hills enfolded. I will sweep misfortunes on them. Literally, I will add misfortunes. That is, I will heap evils upon them. For the verb, see, add year to year, and add your burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat. See also, 227, my comment to the utter ruin of moist and dry alike. Another reading is that of New Translation, which follows, lest you be swept away because of the iniquity of the city. All right, so just trying to get a sense of what the word means. Use up my arrows on them. In fact, the punishment is a blessing in disguise. I will use up my arrows before they themselves are finished off. Wasting famine, onkelos, the Aramaic translates, they will be swollen with famine. But I can find no evidence to support this translation. I have heard in the name of Moses Hadarshan of Toulouse that it means hairy with hunger. This Hebrew word means hair in Aramaic. In our verse, it refers to one who is emaciated, which can cause hair to grow on one's flesh. So I don't know if that's true. If you're emaciated, that it causes hair to grow, but Rashi's trying to make some kind of connection there with the context and with the word. Ravaging plague, rather fought against by Reshef, that is, by demons. See Job 5. For man is born to do mischief, just as sparks fly upward, where the sparks are really the sons of Reshef, using the same Hebrew word as in our verse. That too is a reference to demons. So I wonder also if it's sparks, whether it's a matter of switching the first two letters of the word. So instead of Resh Shin Fe, it would be Shin Resh Pe, and that would give you the root, which reflects fire or sparks. Deadly pestilence, rather extermination by Meriri, the demon with that name. For extermination, see, where, O death, are your plagues? Your destruction, where, O Sheol? Fanged beasts, not beasts, but ordinary domestic animals. There actually was an incident where ewes began to bite and kill. With venomous creepers in dust, more precisely, with the venom of flowing things of the dust, that is, with the poison of snakes who crawl on their bellies in the dust as waters flow across the ground. Anything that moves across the ground in this flowing fashion can be described by this creeping verb. The sword shall deal death without. Outside the city, the sword of the invading troops will bereave, as the Hebrew literally says. As shall the terror within, not within, but in the chambers. Even one who runs away and escapes the sword will feel the chambers of his heart pounding with fear to such an extent that he will die of it. Another reading, within their homes, as in, for death has climbed through our windows, has entered our fortresses to cut off babes from the streets, young men from the squares. This is how Onkelos translates it. Another reading, without, refers to what they have done openly in the street, as the Hebrew word can also mean. For your gods have become as many as your towns, O Judah, and you have set up as many altars to shame as there are streets in Jerusalem. Within refers to what they have done in their innermost chambers. O mortal, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, everyone in his image-covered chamber? We go on 228. I might have reduced them to naught, that is, wipe them out, make an end of them. This should really be explained as related to the use of the same root in, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, where that part of the crop is to be left for the poor. I will cast them away and leave them ownerless. This is how Menachem understands our expression. The matching word in Nehemiah 9:22 is to be interpreted the same way. Others interpret it following the Aramaic, I will bring my anger to bear against them. But this cannot be. Besides the aleph first person prefix, there would have to be a second aleph that is part of this root of the verb. For similar examples with other roots, see Isaiah 45 and Job 16, and the aleph in the middle of our actual word would not belong there at all. Onkelos is actually translating in accordance with the midrash on this word in the Sifrei, which separates af-ehem into three parts. Amarti af-ehem. I said in my anger, I will turn them into nothing, so that all who see them will ask, where are they? Where are they? All right, so we just see the midrash that Rashi's bringing to try to understand these unusual words. And he finishes up on 229, but for fear of the taunts of the foe. Rather, were it not that the provocation of the enemy was gathered upon them for destruction. If they were in fact able to destroy them, they would attribute it to themselves and their gods, not to me. Their enemies who might misjudge, literally who might judge in alien fashion. They might mistakenly attribute their success to an alien god that actually has no greatness, and say, our own hand has prevailed, and so forth. Okay, so that's Rashi on all this. There is Rashbam beginning on 227, wasting famine. The wasting word is translated based on the context and on the Aramaic translation of Onkelos. Though there is a related word in Rabbinic Hebrew, this man's brain has wasted away. Ravaging plague, better the devouring of the fiery bolt. What it is describing is a combination of hail and fire from the sky. For the fiery bolt, see also its darts are darts of fire. But the basic meaning of the word is that it's a way of referring to flight, as in the flying of birds, just as sparks fly upward. There he broke the fiery arrows of the bow. Note that in Psalm 91, arrows are indeed described as flying. Deadly pestilence, rather embittering extermination. They will be cut down, stabbed by bandits who make people's lives bitter and even kill them. The grammatical form of the embittering word matches based on the judge's determination of Exodus 21. It's not a quality, but a transitive activity. Okay, with regard to the extermination, literally cutting, see the scourge that ravages at noon, as in the destroyer at noonday of Jeremiah 15. This refers to bandits who operate in broad daylight, as we see from Ashdod's people shall be expelled in broad daylight. Okay, and Rashbam on 26, on 228, I might have reduced them to naught, and I would have removed them from the world, but for fear of the taunts of the foe. And he has two comments on 229, who might misjudge. More precisely, the verb is saying that they might judge things precisely opposite than they are, as if they had done it and not I. for they are a folk void of sense. They, the other nations. The unusual vowel of the Hebrew word translated void is there because the word is in construct form. They are void of sense. For similar examples of this vowel, see Genesis 30, Leviticus 27, and Jeremiah 6. Okay, so a lot of comments just about the unusual words and their structures. So Ibn Ezra on 226, they incensed me. Ordinarily, the nun in this verb is doubled, but the dagesh is dropped here for ease of pronunciation. So that's a grammatical thing. So sometimes there's a dot in the letter nun, and that's for grammatical purposes. And he says to pronounce it, usually we don't pronounce the dot in letters, except for a few. Like if there's a dot in the letter bet, then it becomes a B instead of a V, or a dot in the pay makes it a P instead of an F. And the dot in the kuf makes it a K instead of a Ch, right? And then if we're Ashkenazi taught old-fashioned Hebrew, there's a dot in the tuf, it's a T or an S. So those letters, the dot means something in pronunciation. The others in modern Hebrew now, it doesn't mean a thing. Perhaps Ibn Ezra's Ibn Ezra's time, there might have been a different pronunciation or an extra emphasis in dots and other letters. So he goes on with no gods, rather a no God using the power word of verse 18, a God with no power to save. With their futilities, their vanities, their nothingnesses, not with something real. I'll incense them. Unlike the first occurrence of the verse, which is PL, this is he feels, so it can take a double object. Okay, so just a grammatical thing. We'll just go on. With a no folk, with a folk that is not my people. A nation of fools, he explains precisely how he intends to vex them by bringing upon them and them alone a series of terrible troubles, the worst of all being a nation of fools, so stupid and vile that they have no idea what it means to commit murder and so kill without thinking. For a fire has flared in my wrath, the jealousy of verse 21, or perhaps, since we do find this verb used transitively in for you have kindled the flame of my wrath, the fire is the evil they will do, which has kindled my wrath. Still, though, the verb is indeed kal, it may well be passive here, as the old translation takes it. For a similar example, see, all these were joined together in the valley of Siddim. Anyway, this fire is a metaphor for anger. To the bottom of Sheol, a stylistic exaggeration, as in the whole land being devastated by sulfur and salt. Has consumed the earth, rather the land of Israel. Eaten down, rather set ablaze, as in the fiery, ever-turning sword. The base of the hills of Israel. All right, so Ibn Ezra is limiting this to the land of Israel as opposed to other places around the world. I will sweep misfortunes on them. Some take this from the similar sounding verb meaning to increase, but correctly it means to finish off, as in, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Though that verb is, we're on 227 now, in the middle, on the right, kal, and ours is hifil. There will be no evil left that does not come upon them. My arrows, like arrows, these evils will arrive so suddenly that there is no way to defend against them. Wasting famine, rather burnt with hunger, compare, he gave an order to heat up the furnace to 7 times its usual heat. Ravaging plague, rather devoured by flying creatures, as in just as sparks fly upward. But this is indeed a reference to plague. As I see it, there are 4 evils mentioned in this passage: famine, plague, pestilence, wild beasts, and the sword of verse 25. So our flying word must be related to its darts are darts of fire, referring to air that breeds fever. Deadly pestilence, rather bitter pestilence, air that is bitter as well as feverish. For pestilence, see also the plague that stalks in the darkness, or the scourge that ravages at noon. Literally, this word means cutting off. With venomous creepers and dust to bite them. Venomous here is really heated, a metaphor for the result of the bite. And they are really venomous terrifiers, as in, I was too awestruck and fearful. These are like the seraph serpents and scorpions of chapter 8. The mere sight of them is terrifying. The participle, or any other adjective, can be used as a noun, as we see in the Amim of chapter 2, whose name also means that they are frighteners. To youth and maiden alike, too, is not in the Hebrew, but all these are objects of the death dealing at the beginning of the verse. The suckling as well as the aged, the same 4 categories are grouped in youths and maidens alike, old and younger together.
Jonah,
Yes.
he has the 4 evils, but
Yes.
it doesn't include anything about fire, and fire has a lot of references, the sparks and the fire and
Right.
the nostrils, and it's not
Yeah,
there anymore.
I'm not sure why he's not mentioning fire as one of the plague, but he does say the sparks flying is creating an atmosphere of pestilence, of fever. So I think he's comparing the fire to the plague or the pestilence. All right, he goes on 228. I might have, literally, I said, that is, I thought. Anthropomorphically, having God say, I said to myself. Reduce them to naught. Some take the single Hebrew verb as a compound of 3 separate words. In fact, it is a hapax legomenon, unrelated to any other word in the Bible. Made their memory cease among men. This makes clear that the unusual preceding verb means utterly destroy. They will all die if, as the lexicographers think, it meant to cast them aside, then the parallelism with made their memory cease would not work. Others think the af syllable of the verb indicates that it specifically means, I will destroy them in my anger, which certainly does make the parallelism work, so that could be correct, except that the verb anger has a nun as the second letter of the root, which is missing in our word. In short, my answer is the correct one. And he goes on 229 in the middle on the right, but for fear, as in Moab was alarmed. Onkelos derives the word from gathers in its food at the harvest, understanding that the enemy forces are gathered against them. But it really comes from a word meaning fight. I perish from your blows. Having God speak as if fighting out of fear of the foe is anthropomorphic, of course. The text uses this kind of language so that ordinary people can understand. Misjudge, the word yenakeru, is the opposite of yakiru, recognize. Both words being from the same root. You will find 2 comparable opposites from this root in when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like a stranger toward them. Our own hand has prevailed against the tribes of Israel. For they are a folk void of sense, they being correctly understood as the enemy nations. Onkelos cleverly recognized that void here must be in construct with sense. For the syntax, compare wilted of leaf. The Hebrew might be read to take sense as the direct object of the verb void, but that verb is always intransitive, to be void. Okay, let's look at Nachmanides. Back on 226 in the middle on the left, with no gods. If Rashi's comment is correct, this is a reference to the demons previously mentioned. What the text is actually saying is without the true God, as in Israel has gone many days without the true God. For there is no God except for the Lord, no helper other than he. Vexed me with their futilities, the demons. I'll incense them with a no folk, the Chaldeans of whom we read, behold, the land of Chaldea. This is the people that has ceased to be, a people that was not even considered a nation, yet the Holy One raised them up to the point that he ruled his world through them. You are my war club, my weapons of battle. With you I clubbed nations, with you I destroyed kingdoms. Vex them with a nation of fools, of ingrates. See my comment to dull in verse 6. This is Esau, who is ungrateful enough to ignore the covenant of brotherhood. The two phrases allude to the two exiles. Right, so we had those ideas as well about which time frame this poem is referring to. Is it the Babylonian exile, or is it the exile after the destruction of the temple by the Romans?
Esau was also considered a basis for, I know Rome, but now
Yes.
Christianity too? I didn't know that.
Yes, that's right. Yep. And Nachmanides goes on in 228. I might have reduced them to naught. The grammarians take the verb here to mean scattered them in every direction. The verse literally begins with I said, which would therefore mean that the intention came before the divine aspect of justice, that they should be scattered in every direction, which would have made their memory cease among men, were it not for fear of the taunts of the foe. But in my opinion, the difficult form of that verb is indeed the compound word described by the Sifrei, the Midrash on Deuteronomy. What it means, however, is this: I will put them in a place and a situation where people will even say, Ahem, where are they? Meaning that no trace of them remains among the nations and no one knows where they are. This is an allusion to the exile of the 10 tribes who were exiled beyond the river Gozan, which our sages call the Sambatyon because it ceases its raging only on the Sabbath. Gozan refers etymologically to the fact that they are cut off from the rest of humanity on the other days of the week. The M and the Yon of Sambatyon are strictly linguistic changes. Okay, so that's Midrash about what happened to the 10 tribes based on a verse in 2 Kings where they were exiled beyond the river Gozan. Okay. Made their memory cease among men. This refers to our exiles among the nations. We, the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, whom they no longer considered to be a nation. The verse is saying that as far as the divine aspect of justice was concerned, we could stay in exile forever if it were not for fear of the taunts of the foe. This teaches us that in our current exile, the merits of the patriarchs have been exhausted, and we have no rescue other than the great name of the Holy One. When I bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands in which you are scattered, I will accept you as a pleasing odor, and I will be sanctified through you in the sight of the nations. Then, O house of Israel, you shall know that I am the Lord when I deal with you for my name's sake, not in accordance with your evil ways and corrupt acts. See also Ezekiel 29, I acted for the sake of my name. That is why Moses in his prayer reminds God that if he slays the entire people, he must fear what the nations who have heard your fame will say. And why God responds, I pardon as you have asked. The point is not that the Holy One wants to demonstrate his power to his enemies, for all nations are as naught in his sight. He accounts them as less than nothing. No, the Lord created humanity in the lower worlds to recognize their creator and praise his name. He put license in their hands to do evil or good. When all the others deliberately sinned and denied him, he had only his people left to his name. Through them, by means of signs and wonders, he made known that he was God of gods and Lord of hosts, and became so known among all the nations. If he should now renege and make all memory of them perish, the other nations would forget his signs and his deeds would no longer be recounted among them. If anyone did mention them, they would think it had been done by some power of the stars and constellations that was no longer operative. This would nullify the entire purpose of creation, since humanity would no longer know their creator. They would be able to do nothing but present him with vexation. From the perspective of God's will, then, it would make sense that as part of creation, the will would arise before him to establish a nation that would be his forever. They would be closer to him and would know him better than any of the other nations. That is why the Lord will vindicate his people and take revenge for his servants. The Lord will remember his aspect of mercy because they have been his people long since. He will remember that they are his servants who stood by him in their exile, like slaves willingly bearing all the troubles of servitude. Surely they are my people, children who will not play false. As I hinted in my comment to Exodus 29, there is a lofty, ineffable secret requiring that we be his people and he be our God, all who are linked to my name, whom I have created, formed, and made for my glory. And he has one more comment on 229, for they are folk void of sense. This entire passage refers to the enemies already mentioned, as Rabbi Nehemiah says in the Sifrei. The text is saying that they ought to have realized that everything that happened to Israel was done to them by the Lord on account of their sins. They ought to have deduced that the same thing would eventually happen to them, for the Holy One will indeed eventually do this to all the other nations who are far more rebellious toward him than Israel. And the additional comments on this, bottom of 226, they incensed me with no gods. It was at the end of the Second Temple period that the faith that so incensed him was created, being founded by those who lived at that time. When they incensed him, the period of hiding the countenance ended, and their measure for measure punishment began. Notice that this is where the poem begins to be in God's voice rather than that of Moses. Nothing incenses him more than attributing divinity to flesh and blood. I'll incense them with a no folk, people that are not really people, but more like animals. Eaten down to the base of the hills, the tunnels where the Israelites would hide. As we read in Judges 6, the Israelites provided themselves with refuges in the caves and strongholds of the mountains. Or perhaps it means to the base of the actual hills underground. Even in Sheol, they would be unable to escape this fire. The hills, or rather mountains, are metaphoric here for the fortified walls of the cities, the strongest of which were indeed built atop the high mountains. His anger was so fierce that it was not enough for him to wreak vengeance on human beings. It must consume the entire land of Israel. My arrows, a metaphor for the troubles that would come upon them so suddenly that there was no way to guard against them. Bottom of 227, wasting famine, literally the melting away produced by hunger. S is replaced here by Z, but that is common since they sound similar and are produced in the same location in the mouth. Ravaging plague, rather feverish flesh, compared to Zephaniah 1, their flesh like dung. Note that the evils in this verse, properly understood, are listed in order of increasing severity. All these evils are both literal and also metaphoric for their enemies among the nations. To youth and maiden alike, the suckling as well as the aged, the enemy will not take pity on any of them. And on the bottom of 228, I might have reduced them to naught. The word af-ahem means the opposite of what the commentators think. It cannot mean that he might have scattered them to the four winds, if not for the fear of the taunts of the foe. For this is exactly what he did do. Rather, it means that he might have put them in a single corner of the earth. This is what had previously happened to the 10 lost tribes who have completely disappeared from human ken. It was a great act of charity that the Holy One scattered us throughout the world. Otherwise, we might have ended up like the Trojans, concentrated in a single tiny spot on the globe and completely wiped out there by the Greeks. This has happened to many other nations as well. Now, the King of England destroyed all the Jews in his realm, and later the King of France did the same. It's only being scattered throughout the world that has kept us alive. Rather, I decided I would leave a payah, one fragment or remnant of them, and wipe out the rest. As we read in Joel 3, everyone who invokes the name of the Lord shall escape, for there shall be a remnant on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, as the Lord promised. Anyone who invokes the Lord will be among the survivors.
Jonah,
Yes, Bess?
how could a Barbanel who lived 100 years before, when were the Jews expelled from England?
1290.
Okay, and they came back in 1600 something?
Right. So, and Abarbanel's 1490.
Okay.
So he would know.
And France expelled the Jews?
Yes, there was a burning of all Jewish texts in Paris in the 1300s.
From the plague? Because of the plague?
I don't know why. I don't remember. So Barbanel knew about that because he was a wealthy man and he was in the Spanish court, so he had access to history books and manuscripts and the like. Rather, I decided I would leave a payah, one fragment, or remnant of them, and wipe out the rest. As we read in Joel 3, everyone who invokes the name of the Lord shall escape, for there shall be a remnant on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, as the Lord promised. Anyone who invokes the Lord will be among the survivors. Okay, bottom of 229, for they are folk void of sense, void of the 7 commandments they were given to observe. If Rabbi Nehemiah is correct, that this refers to the nations. Okay, that's it for the commentary on these verses. We can read a little bit more.
Such a terrible, vengeful God.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what this poem is pointing out. To be
The image is so frightening.
Yeah, it's supposed to make us afraid when we read it, so that we stay in line and not stray. So let's start the 5th Aliyah. Let's do 29 to 33. Lu chachmu yaskilu zot yavinu la'acharitam. Echa yirdof echad elef ushnayim yanisu revava. Im lo kitzuram necharam va'adonai hiskiram. Ki lo kitzurenu tzuram va'oivenu plilim. Ki migefen stom gafnam umishadmot amora. Anavemo inverosh ashkelot merorot lamo. Chamat taninim yenam. The Rosh Petanim Achzar. Were they wise, they would think upon this, gain insight into their future. How could one have routed 1,000, or two put 10,000 to flight? Unless their rock had sold them, the Lord had given them up. For their rock is not like our rock, in our enemies' own estimation. The vine for them is from Sodom, from the vineyards of Gomorrah. The grapes for them are poison, a bitter growth their clusters. Their wine is the venom of asps, the pitiless poison of vipers. Rashi, gain insight into their future. If they were wise, they would employ their wisdom in trying to gain insight into their latter end. That is what lies behind Israel's punishment. How could one of us have routed 1,000 of the Israelites unless their rock had sold them? The Lord had given them up, delivered us into their hands, to use the French expression. We'd have to see the Hebrew to see what the French expression was. For their rock is not like our rock. I could look it up. Let me see if I can find the French on that. Let's see. It's just 1 second here. 32. 32. That was verse 30. Right? Yes. 32:30. Let's see if I can see what the French is. Oh, delibraire. It looks like delibraire. Delivered us into their hands. Yeah, so deliver. I guess that's a French word that comes into the English language. Okay. It's kind of hard to figure out because Rashi's writing Hebrew letters like French transliteration, right? So it's kind of hard to know exactly how it should be pronounced. Okay, so he goes on 230, for their rock is not like our rock. Verses 27 to 30 all say that the enemies ought to have understood that in fact it was the Lord who handed the Israelites over to them. The victory did not belong to them or their gods, for up to this point, their gods had been able to achieve nothing against our rock. In our enemies' own estimation, rather our enemies now being our judges, that is our rulers, for our rock has delivered us into their hands. The vine for them is from Sodom. This resumes verse 26. I might have made their memory cease, for their deeds are those of Sodom and Gomorrah. Vineyards, the Hebrew word simply means agricultural fields of any kind. The fields produce no grain. In the fields of Kidron. Okay, so other examples. The grapes for them are poison. The Hebrew word is a homonym of the word for head, but this word refers to a bitter grass, gall, as the old translation puts it. A bitter growth, their clusters. They deserve a bitter drink. Their punishment matches their deeds. Indeed, Onkelos translates it precisely that way. Their wine is the venom of asps, as Onkelos translates, like the bitterness of snakes is their cup of punishment. The pitiless poison of vipers, their cup bites cruelly. A cruel enemy will come to exact this punishment from them. Okay, so Rashbam on this, back on 229 on the right, were they wise? Were the nations wise? How could one have routed 1,000? How could one of us have routed 1,000 of Israel as they were used to doing with us, if their rock had not handed them over to us because they sinned against him? Remember what verse 4 says. And it goes on in 230, for their rock is not like our rock. Moses is now speaking in his own voice. He is emphasizing that the enemies ought to have admitted that the Holy One did this and not the gods of the nations. For Israel's rock is not like the rock of the other nations of the world. In our enemies' own estimation, rather, even so, our enemies execute judgment against us. Must this not therefore be done at the hands of the Holy One against whom they have sinned? The vine for them is from Sodom. That is, if it were not for the presumption of the nations, I might have reduced Israel to naught, for they are from the vine of Sodom. They ought to have drunk from the cup of justice, leaving no memory of them among men, as happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. For they sinned as grievously as did Sodom and Gomorrah. They avow their sins like Sodom. And indeed, Isaiah calls them, you chieftains of Sodom, you folk of Gomorrah. Their wine is the venom of asps. This is the wine they ought to have drunk, the wine of justice, were it not for the desecration of God's name that would be caused on 231 by the enemy's misjudgment in declaring our own hand has prevailed. The pitiless poison of vipers. A viper is a wicked person. The wicked are defiant from birth. Their venom is like that of a snake, a deaf viper that stops its ears. Ibn Ezra on this. We are on 229, below the Nachmanides there, beginning with number 29. Were they wise, they would think upon this, that all of this was wrought by the Lord on Israel because of their iniquity. Gain insight into their future, the Lord will do the same things to them because of their sins. How could one have routed 1,000? If Israel were wise enough to understand how one of the enemy could have routed 1,000 Israelites, they would realize it could only be because their rock had abandoned them. But some think the question is meant this way. How could one Israelite have routed 1,000 of the enemy, and yet now they have become so weak? Unless their rock had sold them, not literally sold for money. It's like saying that he gave them, as in the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. It is as if he gave them to the enemy as the reward for their evil deeds, which is selling after all. Give them up. It will be our task to deliver him into your majesty's hands. Or perhaps it's to be taken more literally, close them up, as the word is used in whomever he imprisons cannot be set free. And he goes on 230 in the middle on the right, for their rock is not like our rock. This is in the voice of Moses. They are a folk void of sense. It's our rock who sold us. They have no rock like ours, and they are no better than us. In our enemy's own estimation, rather, the negation of the first part of the verse continues here. For their rock is not like our rock, and our enemies are no judges of the situation. For another example of implicit negation, see, I have not learned wisdom, nor do I possess knowledge of the Holy One. But some do indeed take it, as the translations do, positively. Our enemies themselves admit. This translation demands a paragraph break after verse 31, which otherwise links naturally to verse 32. From the vineyards of Gemara, though the Hebrew word sounds like the word for fields, the parallelism shows that New Translation translates correctly. A bitter growth their clusters. This too clearly parallels the grapes for them are poison. Their wine is the venom of asps, literally the heat of asps. The wine from these bitter grapes burn like the venom of an asp. The pitiless poison of vipers, for the viper compare a babe shall play over a viper's hole. Poison is correct, though, spelled here, 231, like the homonym that means head. It carries the same meaning as if spelled with a vav, not an aleph. Pitiless would be better translated as fierce. Note that the aleph of this word is not part of the root. Okay, Nachmanides on this starts with number 30 on 229. How could one have routed 1,000? How could one of us have routed 1,000 of Israel? Unless their rock had sold them, for their rock is more powerful, more capable of helping and rescuing than our rock. 230, for their rock is not like our rock. Despite the translations, this too is in the words of the enemy. For their rock is not like our rock. In our enemies' own estimation, rather our enemies, the Israelites, were judges. They could have executed judgment against us right from the start. Why is it that now 1,000 of them flee from the shouts of one of us? If it were not that their mighty rock had sold them and cast a faintness into their hearts, so that they shall fall, though none pursues. For judges see, truly you must bear the disgrace of serving as your sister's advocate. Pinchas stepped forth and intervened. The vine for them is from Sodom. This is saying that the idol worshippers are void of sense. They have no brains. They do not understand. There's nothing in their minds but evil all day long. For they are rooted in evil and can produce nothing but bitter fruit, so evil that whoever eats of it will die. The idea is that Israel will acknowledge, confess, and repent in their time of distress, saying, why has all this befallen us? But the idolater is void of sense. He has no understanding, but simply follows his particular brand of idol worship. eternally denying the Lord just because he inherited it from his ancestors. He is from a stock sprouting poison weed and wormwood. They are useless and always will be, but Israel, who came from good stock, if it is cut down, it will renew itself and will produce good fruit. And we'll conclude today with the additional comments here, bottom of 229. Were they wise, they would think upon this. The nations would understand that for one of them to rout 1,000 of Israel must be a supernatural occurrence. How could one have routed 1,000 or two put 10,000 to flight? So each of the two would put 5,000 to flight, whereas on the positive side, 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Where the highest proportion is no more than 1 to 100. This sounds as if the punishment is far worse than the reward, but remember that the Leviticus verse continues, your enemies shall fall before you by the sword, so there was no need for one to give chase to more than 100. All this follows the presumption of Rabbi Judah that verses 28 and following refer to Israel. It's Rabbi Nehemiah's view that seems to follow the straightforward sense of the text. For their rock is not like our rock. This is a rhetorical question. Isn't their rock completely unlike our rock? And yet, our enemies wreak judgment upon us. Estimation, the Hebrew word also occurs only in Exodus 21 and Job 31. The vine for them is from Sodom, from the vineyards of Gomorrah. This too is a rhetorical question. Is the vine for them from Sodom? No. For as Jeremiah 2 tells us, I planted you with noble vines, all with choicest seed. Alas, I find you changed into a base and alien vine. Israel too is compared to a vine or vineyard in Hosea 10 and Isaiah 5. Okay, we'll continue this awful punishment that the poem talks about next week. And then hopefully, we'll see. I don't know. There's some long Rashis coming up. We'll see how far we can get next week. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Wish you a good rest of the day.
Good Shabbos.
And a good week ahead.
Shabbat shalom.
Take care. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye.